All right, let's jump right into this explainer where we're going to break down the absolute fascinating legal playbook used to determine when a simple accident is just, well, an accident, and when it officially crosses the line into legal negligence. It's this incredibly tricky space where everyday human error crashes into strict, objective rules. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how the courts navigate that divide. Because honestly, these aren't just abstract ideas for law students. These are the exact rules you're judged by every single time you hop behind the wheel, show up to work, or even just play a game of catch. To really understand how courts decide fault, we're going to hit 5 key areas. We'll start with the baseline standard, then we'll explore the exceptions, evaluate real-world risks, balance out costs versus benefits, and finally, look at the actual concept of damage. Let's kick things off with area number 1, the reasonable person, which is our baseline for liability. This is where every single negligence claim truly begins. So, once it's legally established that a duty of care is owed, the person making the claim has to prove that duty was broken. But how do you actually do that? Well, you have to show the defendant failed to reach an objective standard. And here's the kicker. The law does not care if you were just having a remarkably bad day or if you're naturally a little bit clumsy. You are strictly judged against the standard of the ordinary, competent person performing that specific task. Now, I absolutely love this historical detail. Back in the day, the courts vividly described this everyday, reasonable person as the man on the Clapham omnibus. It's just a wonderful, slightly old-timey British phrase that basically means the regular person on the street. Not a genius, not some flawless superhero, just a typical commuter going about their day. That guy right there, he's our baseline. Which brings us to area 2, modifying the standard, and when those rules actually change for certain people. Because what happens if our defendant isn't just an ordinary commuter, but a highly trained doctor, a total beginner, or literally a child? Let's look at professionals first, using the really famous 1957 Bolam case. Here, a patient undergoing electroconvulsive therapy suffered a broken pelvis, and the whole dispute was about whether relaxant drugs should have been used. The court realized you can't judge a doctor by the standard of a guy riding a bus. Instead, they're judged by the standard of their ordinary, competent peers. Basically, if a substantial body of medical opinion would support what that doctor did, even if some other doctors completely disagree, they haven't breached their duty. This brings up a completely wild contrast. While professionals get to be judged by their peers, beginners absolutely do not. In the 1971 Nettleship case, the court ruled that a learner driver, even someone sweating it out on their 3rd lesson ever, is judged by the exact same standard as an experienced everyday driver. Sounds totally unfair, right? But the courts decided this was a must, largely so injured victims could fairly claim against car insurance. So, if you're out there learning a new skill that puts people at risk, just remember, the law expects competence right out of the gate. However, age does actually shift the baseline. Take the incredibly tragic 1998 Mullin case. 2 15-year-old girls were messing around, play fighting with plastic rulers. One snapped, and a piece of plastic blinded one of the girls. The court had to step back and say, wait, we can't judge her as a reasonable adult. We have to judge her as a reasonable 15-year-old schoolgirl. Because your average teenager just isn't going to foresee that kind of extreme danger from a flimsy plastic ruler. The court ruled there was no breach of duty. Moving right along to area 3, evaluating the risks. Once we know who is being judged, we have to look at the context, because context is everything. I want you to stop and ask yourself this before we move on. Think about your own intuition here. If a risk is basically 1 in a million, does the law actually expect you to spend your time and money trying to prevent it? To answer that, let's travel back to 1951 for the Bolton case. Picture this. A quiet street right next to a cricket ground. A batsman hits an absolute scorcher. The ball clears a 17-foot-high fence, travels a massive distance, and tragically hits a woman just walking down the street. Well, the court crunched the numbers, and the evidence showed a ball had only been hit out of that ground 6 times in 30 years. Because the statistical risk was just exceptionally low, the court found the cricket club had actually taken adequate precautions with their 17-foot fence. It boils down to a simple rule. The lower the risk, the fewer precautions you need to take. Now, flip that around and compare it to the 1965 Haley case. An electricity board dug a trench in London. They put up warning signs, sure, but no physical barriers. A blind man walking down the street tragically fell in. Because it was widely known that this exact road was frequently used by blind individuals, the risk of injury was incredibly high. So the court ruled that simply putting up signs was nowhere near enough. Failing to put up barriers was a massive breach of duty. And keep in mind, a risk skyrockets if the victim is uniquely vulnerable. In the Paris case, a worker who was already blind in one eye was given a task with a tiny risk of metal splinters. Normally, you wouldn't even get goggles for this job. But because losing his one good eye would literally result in total blindness, the stakes for him were catastrophic. The court said the employer absolutely should have provided goggles specifically for him. That brings us to Area 4, balancing cost and benefit. The real-world variables. We have to ask if the massive cost of preventing an accident actually outweighs the public benefit of whatever you're doing, because the law has to be practical. You can really see this pragmatism in the 1953 Latimer case. A huge storm floods a factory, leaving a super slippery mix of water and oil on the floor. The owners evacuated everyone, spread sawdust everywhere to soak it up, and then let workers back in. Unluckily, a worker still slipped and got hurt. But the court noted the only way to perfectly guarantee zero slips would have been to completely shut the factory down for an extended period. At the time, they decided that cost was totally unreasonable, and the sawdust was a good enough precaution. The courts are also surprisingly forgiving about what we simply don't know, or what we do in an absolute panic. In the Roe case, a patient was paralyzed by contaminated anesthetic due to microscopic, literally invisible cracks in glass tubes, something completely unknown to science at the time. You obviously can't prevent a risk you don't know exists. And in emergencies, like the Watt case, where the fire service rushed a heavy jack on the wrong truck to save a trapped woman, the court said no breach happened. Why? Because the immense public benefit of saving a life justified taking a risk with the equipment. So, if we pull all these seemingly chaotic variables together, we can really map out how courts establish the rules. Whether we're talking about a specialized doctor, a panicked learner driver, the odds of a cricket ball going rogue, or a heroic fire crew, the reasonable standard isn't fixed. It's constantly moving and adapting to the raw reality of the situation. Finally, our fifth area, did it cause damage? The absolute final puzzle piece. Let's say you've successfully proven the standard was breached. You still have one last hurdle before you win your case. You've got to prove damage. And hey, quick legal terminology timeout here. Damage, singular, is the actual physical injury or loss that you suffered. Do not confuse this with damages, plural. Damages is the cash compensation the court hands you at the end. Basically, you have to prove the damage to get the damages. To actually win, you have to relentlessly follow this exact formula. 1. Prove the duty of care exists. 2. Prove a breach occurred based on all those risk standards we just went over. And 3. Prove that the specific breach was the factual cause of your foreseeable damage. Which brings us to the ultimate hurdle, factual causation. So here's a final thought to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. How exactly does a judge distinguish between an injury directly caused by someone's negligent mistake versus an injury that unfortunately would have happened anyway, regardless of what the defendant did? That unbelievably thin line between clear liability and pure coincidence? Well, that's where the real courtroom battles are fought.